Today's daf we're going to learn is Moed Katan Hey. It was great seeing many of you at the Shiur last night. Everything is up online. You can find it all on Megillah daf 32. If you just search that on the site, you'll find everything with the Shiur in there. Thank you for everyone who was involved. We are now getting to our daf. Today's daf is sponsored by David and Mitzi Geffen in loving memory of Rabbanit Sarah Hannah Rabinowitz Geffen on her yurtzeit. She and her husband, Rav Tuvia Geffen, Rabbi of Shiur, Israel in Atlanta, brought up their 8 children in a life of learning. 7 of her grandchildren now live in Israel. This daf is sponsored by Talia Kirschenbaum in honor of Ariel Frankston Maris. Thank you for encouraging and inspiring us to jump back on the Daf Yomi bandwagon from Masechet Megillah to Skila Mitzvot. Today's daf is sponsored by Vered Wexler in loving memory of her grandmother, Morty Margaret Renta Sarah Bat Lilu. Okay, Tu B'Shvat Sameach to everybody. Hope you're doing something to celebrate, at least maybe eating some dried fruits. Okay, we're going to start with Mitaknim et Kilkulei Hamayim Sheburshat Harubim. I just want to point out, if you're struggling a little bit with Masechet Moed Katan, I just want to point out that each Masechet has its own kind of nature, and even the editing of the Masechtot and the style is a little bit different. And I will say that the style of this Masechet is a little bit more complicated than some other Masechtot, and it's not the most complicated that you'll come across, but it is a bit of a complicated Masechet and a little bit disjointed. So I'll just kind of point that out in case you're feeling it. So, I mean, there is truth to what you're sensing. Okay, we're now going back to the Mishnah. Because again, this is a good example of where they don't come and give you everything from the beginning. Here are the rules, and here in general, the Mishnah, we know that the Gemara doesn't really do that, right? We're kind of starting almost in the middle, kind of like lots of things about Chol HaMoed without getting to the real issue of where did this come from, this issue of Chol HaMoed and work on Chol HaMoed and all of that. And that's also interesting in and of itself. And they kind of expect you as we go on to kind of gather details and ultimately form a full picture of what's going on here. So you have to kind of have patience, and we'll get the whole picture as we go on. So the Mishnah had said that you can fix all sorts of things that are messed up in the water. And then this is the word we're going to focus on that they actually don't even quote, which says v'chotitinotam. Okay, chotitinotam seems to mean you can take out rocks and other things that were stuck at the bottom of the water in order to fix the water. So the Gemara says, from here we can infer what? Classic inference from a Mishnah. Chatita in, chafira lo. Seems like yes to chatita, but not to chafira. Like let's say people need water and you want to dig so that you can have rainwater collected. You obviously can't do that on the holiday. I say obviously, but maybe it's not so obvious. Comes Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. He said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Lo shanu ela, this was only she'ein rabim tzrichin lahen. This is only if it's not needed for public use. Aval, rabim tzrichin lahen afilu chafira mutar. But if this is an issue, this is a lot of people need water. Remember what we learned at the end of the Mishnah? Osim kol tzorchei rabim. You can do anything for the public need. So therefore, if people need it, then even on Chol HaMoed, you can go and dig a well, dig a ditch so that water can collect there and people can have water to drink. So now the Gemara is going to have a little bit of an issue with this based on a Braita. And this Braita is going to kind of get a little bit confusing because we're going to try to figure out what exactly is the case of the Braita. Is it a case where Rabim Tzrichim or not? It doesn't actually say it. The Braita is going to distinguish between chafira and chatita, just like we do. And it's going to talk about yachid and rabim, individuals and many people. And then it's going to try to figure out, is the case rabim tzrichim or is the case not rabim tzrichim? And then how does that fit in with Rabbi Yochanan? So we're going to read this Braita in a few different ways. And you can see this charted out on the page. Each chart kind of has it in a different way. So right now, we're bringing this as a question on Rabbi Yochanan. So we want to say from here that even if many people need it, it's still going to be forbidden to dig. So the Braita here says that we're going to quote. So if people need it, is it really allowed? V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita? You can clean out wells, ditches, all sorts of caves of individuals. These are all different shapes of cisterns and things that collect water. And Okay, you can do chotetin for an individual, and obviously, if you can do it for an individual, you can obviously do it for many people. ואין חופרים בורות שיחין ומערות של רבים, ואין צריך לומר של יחיד. And yet, even though you can clean them out, you can't dig ones that belong to the public. And obviously, then you wouldn't even need to say if it's my own individual well. Obviously, then I can't dig one if it's for my use. So now, what do we assume? We're going to assume now, and I say we're going to assume because later we'll eventually say something different. We're going to assume that all the cases of this Braita are the same, meaning they're the same situation, same general situation. We have four things really. There's four parameters. There's two, and then within each one, there's two. There's chotetin, which is cleaning out, and there's chofrin, which is digging. And each one, we talk about individual and public. And then we actually don't distinguish individual and public here. It's all the one and the same. So now we're going to assume my lav bisherabim tzrichin lahen. When we say it's a public well, we must mean that it's a public well that the people need. So if that's the case, we're going to have a problem because what does it say here? Chotetin, yes. Chofrim, digging, no. And we just said that Rabbi Yochanan said that you can dig if it's for the purposes of many people. If the community needs it, you're allowed to. Assuming that this Braita is referring to a case where the people do need it, the public needs it, then we're going to have a problem with Rabbi Yochanan. That's where we're at right now. I want you to keep following because it gets a little tricky. So now the Gemara says, Lo, you can just very simply answer this question by saying, B'she'en rabim tzrichin lehen. Okay? Very simply, let's just say, okay, no. The Braita means it's a public well, or we want to dig a public well, but not in a case where people need it. Okay? It's a case where people don't need it. Okay, well, that sounds okay, except what? What's the problem with this? Dikavate gabe yachid. In other words, once we say that the Rabim cases, Rabim don't need it, then the Yachid case would have to be the Yachid doesn't need it either, right? An individual, we're going to assume that all these cases are the same. In other words, not the same, but parallel to each other. So if we're talking about a case where we're going to allow something or not allow it for the people, let's say we don't allow it to be dug for the people, right? We don't allow it on a Rabim level, on a public level, and not on an individual level, or chotetim, where we permit both for an individual and for the public. We're going to have to say that all these cases, though, are the same general idea. Are they needed by whoever it belongs to, or are they not needed? So if we say it's talking about a case where the community doesn't need it, and then we'd have to say the individual is talking about a case where the individual doesn't need it either. Well, now we're going to be stuck. Because what? Chatita mishare. If it's a case, if we're going to now say all the cases again are the same basic idea, which now we've defined all of the cases as being there is no need for them. Now, if I have an individual well and it gets dirty, full of rocks, and I want to now remove the rocks on Yantif, on Chol Moed, sorry. I want to move them on Chol Moed. Am I allowed to do that if I have no need for it? Well, right now, we're going to see in a Braita, it's clear that no, I can't. In which case, our whole assuming that the Mishnah is talking about a case where the Rabim don't need it, and then we'd have to assume also the Yachid doesn't need it. When we go to the Chatita case, it makes no sense. In other words, we've resolved the Chafirah case. You can't dig it because you don't need it, right? If the Rabim needed it, it would be okay. That's Rabbi Yochanan. But it doesn't fit with the beginning part of the Braita in the Yachid case. Okay, so how so? Because Hatanya, it says in a Braita, what are you allowed to do on Chol Moed? Konsim mayim litochan. You can collect water in them. Aval lo chotetin. You can't do chotetin. Now, obviously, if you can't do it, our Mishnah said you can't do it. The assumption is what? It's because you don't need it, and that's why you can't do it. V'lo shafin et tzidkehen, and you can't fix any cracks in it. V'shel rabim, if it's public, chotetin otam v'shafin et tzidkehen. Once it's public, you can do these things on Chol Moed. Ve'elamai. So now they're going to say what? Okay, so basically we're assuming, since that's the case, before we move on, that must mean that this case of Yachid en chotetin must be in a case where the individual doesn't need it, and that's why en chotetin, which means our Mishnah that says Yachid chotetin would have to be a case of where the individual does need it, because if the individual didn't need it, it wouldn't be allowed to do chotetin. If we say it's a case where the individual needs it, then we have to go back and say it's when the public needs it, and then we're back at square one with our question. So now let's go back to the Gemara. The Gemara says the elamai. So what do you want to say then? Let's go back to our Braita. B'sheyachid tzarich lehem, dikavate gabe rabim, b'sherabim tzrichim lehem. So now you want to say it's yachid. Yachid needs it, right? And that's why we allow chotetin. We don't allow to dig, but we do allow to clean it. And if we make the parallel to rabim, we'd have to say, again, we're always assuming here, whatever's true for one is true for the other. So rabim is b'sherabim tzrichim lehem. Well, now we're back to square one. Chafira mi asur, right? Is chafira going to be forbidden? Right? Didn't Rabbi Yochanan say it's okay? And furthermore, Bahatanya, doesn't it say, let's look at this Braita we just quoted. Borot shichinu ma'arot shel yachid, konsim mayim letocham v'chotetin otam, aval lo shafin etzikehem v'lo chotetin letochan, v'lo sadin otam b'sid. Okay, these are all sorts of things you can't do with them. But shel rabim chofrin otam v'sadin otam b'sid. But if it's public, then you're allowed to dig. Now this makes it sound like if it's public, you're allowed to dig. Why? Because it's sorchei rabim. So now we're basically concluding that Rabbi Yochanan is correct, right? That Rabbi Yochanan must be right. Now, where did we start? We started by quoting a Braita that seemed to contradict Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was the first comment we had, where he basically said, if the public needs the water, you're allowed to even dig a well. So now we're sorted. We basically say, even though we brought this Braita to contradict, we're going to have to come back to that Braita. From everything else we saw, it seems to indicate because we now saw this other Braita that says Rabim can do these things. And therefore, once it's in need of Rabim, you're allowed to do this. So now they say, because it even said in this Braita, Shel Rabim chofrin otam, you could even dig it and then put limestone in there. And no problem. All that's allowed. So now they say, but we're still stuck with that original Braita that we brought as a contradiction. Elakash yahach kamaita. But the first Braita is still a problem, because we couldn't say, is it Rabim Tzruchim? And is it, right, once we say Rabim Tzruchim, then it's Yachid Tzruchim. If Yachid Tzruchim, none of it really made sense. If Rabim Tzruchim, then you should be allowed to dig. If Rabim ain't Tzruchim, and that's why you can't dig, but then the Chotetim makes no sense, because then the Yachid doesn't need it. If the Yachid doesn't need it, then why should he be allowed to do Chotetim? Clean it out. Shouldn't be allowed at all. So we were stuck with that one. So how do we explain it? Taritz Hachi. This is how we're going to explain the Braita. Now, until now, and this is why I said we were working on this assumption, that what? Until now, we assumed that the entire Braita was referring to the same case, right? If you say Rabim Tzrichim, then Yachid Tzrichim. And if you say it in the second part, then it must be true in the first part. And if you say in the first part, it must be true in the second part. Kind of like everything is the same other than what's different. Rabim Yachid, Chofrim Chotetim. But there's no more parameters than that. It's either all a case of they need it, all a case of they don't need it. And that created a problem because it didn't make any sense with things we knew otherwise. So now the Gemara is going to split the Reisha and the Seifa and basically say that each one is a different case. So now they're going to say like this, Chotetin borot shel yachid. We're now at the beginning. When it says you can clean out the well of an individual, b'sheyachid tzarich lehem, it's when the individual needs it. If I have a well and it got dirty and it's chol Moed, I'm allowed to clean it out because I need it. Ve'ein tzarich lomar b'shel rabim. And of course, if it's a public one, of course I could do it. If I could do it on an individual level, I could obviously do it if it's a public one. Obviously, in which case, kisherabim tzrichim lahem, right? When they need it. And now, this isn't saying the first part, it doesn't say anything about digging, but they say the following. You don't even need to say here, right? The ein sarich lomar that said in the Braita, you don't even need to say public. Obviously, public can be chotetim. Why? And now they're adding words, but it's obvious words to add. Because afilu chafira mutal. Because when it comes to public, you can even go farther than chotetim. If it's a public need, you can even dig a well if you wanted. Now, that's the first part. So even though chafira didn't enter into the first part of the Braita in words, it enters there in assumption, right? That when we have the words and you don't even need to say public because it's obvious. Why is it so obvious? Because even digging a well from the start would be allowed. So obviously, chotetin is allowed in Rabim. The second part now is going to move into a case where you don't need it. Ve'ein choflim borot shichin u'ma'arot shel rabim b'she'ein rabim tzrichin lahem. If already in the first part, we already had that you can dig if the public needs it. So the line in the Braita that says you can't dig wells of rabim and obviously not individual ones is obviously talking about what case? When you don't need it. So if the community doesn't need a well right away, right now, then obviously you can't dig that on Chol HaMoed, right? Let's say you want to do something for the future, but nobody really needs it right now. So you can't start that on Chol HaMoed. Ve'ein sarich lomar shel yachid, and then obviously you don't need to save an individual because what? Now we're going to do the reverse of what we did in the first. Because if the individual doesn't need it, if I have a well in my backyard, not only can I not dig a well from the start on Chol HaMoed if I don't need it, but I can't even do chotetin. I can't even clean out my well if I have no use for it on Yantiv, on Chol HaMoed. So therefore, we've now read this Braita in a way that it fits with all the other sources that we saw. And with that, we resolved it. The only downside of this is we had to kind of add some words and say that one part was talking about when you need it, and the second part was talking about when you don't need it. And then we've resolved all our issues. Okay. Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi is now going to come and say, Matnitin Nami Daika. We started with the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. The Rabbi Yochanan said, when we said that you can do chotetin, but you can't dig, that was only in a case if it's not needed for the public use. But if it's needed for public use, then you can't do it. Now, it didn't say that in the Mishnah, but Rav Ashi is going to say we can infer it from our Mishnah. From where can we infer it? From the end of the Mishnah, the Katan. It says at the end of the Mishnah, it listed a whole bunch of things that you can do for public need. And then it said, Osin kol tzarchei rabim. You can do all things that are needed by the community. Now, I started the Masechet by saying that we don't really get any general rules here, right? There's all these general rules that are underlying, like hefsei meruba, right? Is it going to be, not hefsei meruba, is it going to be a loss, davar ha'aved? Is it going to be a loss, a financial loss, right? Your field will get ruined. Is it tircha yatera? Is it too much work, right? There are all sorts of code words that we don't really see in the Mishnah. But there is one that the Mishnah tells us is a general rule, right? The Mishnah is going to just give us case. From there, we have to derive what the general rules are, which is what makes this Masechet a little bit complicated. But it does give us one general rule. Now, generally, when the Mishnah does give us general rules, especially if it says kol, all tzarchei rabim, that must be to include something additional. So comes Rav Ashi and he says, oh, perfect. The words kol tzarchei rabim must be Kol la'atuye mai, what's this? All tzarchei rabim? Lav la'atuye chafira, is it not coming to say, even if you have to dig a well, that will be allowed? So the Gemara says, that's not a good inference, although eventually we'll reject this and come back and say Rav Ashi's inference is a good inference, but right now we're going to reject it. Lo, that's coming la'atuye ha'detanya, it's coming to include all these cases mentioned in the Braita. That's what it's coming to include. What cases in the Braita? Yotz'im lekavetzet hadrachim. You can go out to remove thorns from the roads. This is something you could do on Chol HaMoed. If there's a lot of thorns on the roads, people are walking. We don't want them to get thorns in their feet. So you can take out thorns from the roads. Ulitakenet harechavot. Remember, sometimes the roads got washed away by the rains. You can fix the roads. Be'et ha'istrata'ot, from the word street, right? It comes from the Greek, istrata'ot, which are these big thoroughfares. Okay, not just any street, it's a big street. And to measure the mikvahs, we want to make sure the mikvahs have enough water in them. If it doesn't have 40 se'ah of water, you channel water to get into there so that it will be filled by 40 se'ah. The Braita says, how do you know? Before we even get to the end part of the Braita, this already is what they're saying against Rav Ashi. No, you can say kol tzarchei rabim is to bring all these cases that you can fix the roads, that you can fix the mikvahs, etc. To which the Gemara says, so the Braita continues before we get back to the Gemara. What if you didn't do all these things? Okay, you might say, yes, we could do this on Chol HaMoed, but better not to, right? It's Chol HaMoed. We don't want to be working. But they say, very, very important line, just in general, not really connected to our sugya, but it says, Shekol damim shenishbachu sham, any blood that was spilled there, right? Somebody slipped on the road because it wasn't paid, or somebody got thorns in them and bled, or God forbid, died from an accident. Ma'aleh alehem hakatuv ki'ilu hem shafchum. The people who were in charge of the city and didn't deal with this and said, oh, I'm not going to do this in Chol Moed, the blood is on their hands, okay? It's their fault. Talmud Lomer, where do we learn this from? V'haya alecha damim. Okay, this is a verse that's talking about in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 19. V'lo yishafech dam naki b'kerev artzecha. You shouldn't spill blood unnecessarily. This is in the section about the Arei Miklat, the refuge cities. Asher Hashem lokecha noten lecha lenachala. You will be responsible for this. So basically, we're saying you're responsible for this happening. So now they say, so basically, again, so first of all, it's this interesting idea that the community is responsible for this happening. Now, I see some questions on, I'm having trouble following the chat today, but if I read it correctly, you're asking, why wasn't this done before? Maybe that's part of the question. This could have been done before, but sometimes it rains on the holiday and all these things get ruined, right? Or it rained just before the holiday and they didn't have time to fix everything, right? There's weather that happens that could change the situation. And now they're in the middle. People are already maybe on Aliyah Rega, but they're going home or they're going back and forth to their houses. So these are things that are very necessary, right? Maybe they're going back to where they're staying. So there's constant need for upkeep of this. So if there's a need, obviously if there's no need, then you don't do it. Again, that was what we saw earlier in the daf. Only if there's a need, you do it. So now they say, that was, Rav Ashi tried to prove kol is coming to say you could even dig a well. Comes the Gemara and says, no, kol comes to include all these other cases, fixing the streets, the mikvahs, all that. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Okay, maybe you remember the Mishnah from Daf Bet, but they say here, maybe you don't, they'll remind you, that was explicit in the Mishnah already. The Mishnah said, maybe not to the extent that the Bright had discussed it, but it already said, so it already listed those basic categories in the Mishnah. So all tzarchei rabim can't be coming to include that case. So what could it be coming to include? Must be coming to include digging, and therefore we can conclude in the end, we've basically proven that Rabbi Yochanan must be right in what he said, that this whole thing that the Mishnah was talking about in the first part, about chotetin, and that you can only clean out the wells, but you can't dig a new one, is only if we don't need it for public use. But if we need it for public use, people need to drink water, we need to collect water for the use of the public, we're allowed to do it. Moving on. That was sugya number one today. Few sugyot, three sugyot basically. Sugya number one was this whole thing about chotetin. Is it chotetin? Yes, chafira, no. Rabbi Yochanan's statement that you can do it if there's need for the public, and then questioning him, is that really true? Bringing in other Braito, trying to figure everything out, and in the end they conclude, yes, he's correct. And not only that, but you can actually infer it from our Mishnah. Now we're moving on to the next. The next thing in the Mishnah is mitzaynim et hakvarot. You can put up markers on graves. Now, again, this was something that they did earlier, before the holiday. Why? Because Kohanim are coming, and Kohanim need to stay pure. Number one, it's forbidden for them to become impure to a dead body. And number two, they're going to eat truma, and you can't eat truma if you're impure. So we need to make sure they know exactly where graves are so they don't walk there. So now, the Gemara is going to ask a question. There's going to be 9 answers to this question. It's always an interesting sugya when there's 9 answers, because it means that no one answer is really good enough, and therefore we have multiple answers. Where do we get an allusion or a hint to tziyun kfarot from the Torah? Okay, this isn't necessarily a deoraita law that tziyun kfarot is important, that you're supposed to mark graves. Oh, so by the way, what I was saying before, I think I stopped mid-sentence. What I was trying to say is, yes, they would mark the graves before, but again, something could happen. The rains could come, winds, blow them away. And what you're basically saying is on Chol Moed, you're allowed to fix them. So now what he's really saying is, how do we know this is so important? Okay, where do we get it from? Now, it doesn't explicitly say it in the Torah, and that's why there's going to be 9 answers. But they're going to try to find allusions to it in the Torah, and sometimes we'll see not exactly in the Torah. In fact, the first source is going to be from Yechezkel, and the Gemara is going to ask that, weren't you looking for something from the Torah? Why are you bringing Yechezkel? That's not really a good proof. So first answer, Talmud Lamal, it says where do we find it? This is Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi speaking. It says, V'ra'a etzem adam ubana etzlo tziyun. It says in Yechezkel, and he saw a bone of a person, and right, you built a tziyun. Okay, you built a marker for it. Amar le Rabina le Rav Ashi says, what do you mean? Before Yechezkel, who said it? Sounds like he was the first who said it. It means it's not really in the Torah. So Rav Ashi says back to him, according to you, I'll bring you a different case where Yechezkel says something and you're going to tell me this wasn't from the Torah. Rav Chisda says the following thing, not what we were talking about, but something else. It doesn't say it in the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. We learn it from Yechezkel. In Yechezkel, it says the following verse: Kol ben nechar arel lev va'arel basar lo yavo amikdashi. Any stranger who's an arel lev, arel basar, this means uncircumcised, is not allowed to come into my temple. It says that in Yechezkel. Now, mekame deleti Yechezkel man amal. Now, before Yechezkel, what? You think people came into the temple who weren't circumcised? No, this is a basic law. Everyone agrees this is a basic law that existed from the time of Moshe. So, therefore, the fact that it first appears in Yechezkel, what do they say? Ela Gemara Gemirila. We had a tradition about it. This is what we call halacha la-Moshe mi-Sinai. It was passed down from Moshe at Sinai, oral Torah. And Yechezkel came along and wrote it down in a verse in his book. But it obviously existed before. So just like we said that there, Hachanami, we're going to say the same thing here. So this is Siyum Kfarot Min HaTorah because it proves basically that Yechezkel is not making something up. He's basically, and this is probably based on the idea that Nevi'im don't make things up. They can't make their own halacha. He's basically discussing something that must have been passed down orally from Moshe. And that's where we have a remez in the Torah because Yechezkel writes in a pasuk, we must assume it was before. Okay? You're asking a question, Dean, about Gemara Gemirila and Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. Most people think that Gemara Gemirila is Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. It's just a different way of saying it. Could be there are some, I didn't look this up, that think that it's something different, but I'm not sure. But I definitely saw people that think this is just means it's Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. Okay, now, that was answer number one. Rabbi Avahu Amar Mehach Tamei Tamei Yikha. This is the Mitzorah, a leper. It says by the leper, Tamei Tamei Yikha. Okay, we will call out that he's tamei, tamei. Notice it repeats it twice, which is a little bit strange. So what do they say? What does this mean? Tum'ah korala v'omeret lo prosh. It's as if the tumah is calling out, the impurity is calling out and saying, stay away from me, stay away from me. Okay, what does that mean? That basically means you have to mark it so that everybody knows it. Obviously, the tumah doesn't speak. So what does it mean? It means that put a marker down so that there's a warning on the tumah that says, right now, obviously this wasn't written about graves, this was written about a leper, but it's the same idea. We can apply it to here. That basically we say what it says there is teaching us about impurity in general. He also said, he has the exact same explanation. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. That pasuk is needed for a different braita. When someone becomes a leper, you have to let everybody know about it. For what reason, right? Sometimes say it's embarrassing. You don't want people to know. But why is it important? People will pray for them. Okay? Now, this is interesting both in the context of, let's say, people are sick. Some people don't like to announce it, let everybody know. On the other hand, it's great because then people will pray for you. Or, let's say what happened in Colleyville the other day, right? It was as soon as that happened, everybody knew, then everybody starts praying around the world for the people. So there's this idea of the community being involved in everybody else's issues is a positive thing. So that's what we learn from it, not this other halacha. So the Gemara answers the obvious. In ken lichto v'tamei my v'tamei tamei shma min hatarta. You can learn two things because it says tamei twice. It could have just said v'tamei and then we know the first halacha. So from there we can learn the second as well. Third answer to our question, where do we get it from the Torah? Now we're going to have easier ones, no discussion on them. Okay, there's the first two we had a long discussion. Don't put a stumbling block in front of someone blind, right? Which doesn't always mean the blind person. It means, right, you don't want to have the Kohanim stumble, so put up a marker. Rav Pap Amar, ve'amar solu panu derech. This is from Yeshayahu. We just mentioned this in the context of it's the Haftorah we read on Yom Kippur. So if you learned Megillah, it was in there. Means, right, clear the way, basically, make way. Okay, here it's really talking about make way to do tshuva, but What we're going to say is make way, meaning make a path for the Kohanim to walk. Rav Chinan Amar, this is kind of funny because he just quotes the second part of that same verse, Harimu michshol miderech hami. Remove all the stumbling blocks from the path. So again, what does remove the stumbling blocks? Mark the graves. Rabbi Yoshua Breder of Idyama. This is from Parshat Shavua, Yitro. It's interesting that we're bringing Yitro as a proof. Basically, when he tells Moshe, you need to set up a judging system, right? So you're not the one doing everything. And he says, and these people will teach, right? You'll show the people the way that they will go. What does it mean you'll show the people the way they will go? Oh, you'll show the Kohanim what path they can walk. Obviously, it's not literal, right? This is just as we were looking anyway for just a remez, some sort of hint to this. Marzutra Amar, it's another verse from the Torah. We should keep the Jews away from becoming tameh. How do we do that? By showing the grave markers. Rav Ashi Amar, mishmarti. This is for the Kohanim. You should protect my mishmeret, right? I don't know how you exactly translate that word. Asu mishmeret lemishmarti. Make a protection for those who protect me, basically. So that's for the Kohanim. Ravina Amar, v'sam derech er'ena b'yesh Elohim. Now this sounds okay. This is a pasuk from Tehillim. One who makes a path, which is again the graves, marking the graves. Er'ena b'yesh Elohim. He will find salvation. Okay, he will be redeemed by God. So there you have, again, someone who makes a path, that's Tziyun Kevin. But Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is going to say, I understand that pasuk differently. I'm a Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Instead of reading V'sam derech, he reads it as V'sham derech. Okay, Sham, the word Shammai in Hebrew is someone who comes and estimates like the value of things. So Sham is usually someone who calculates, who thinks. So Kol hasham orchotav zoche v'ro'eh b'yeshuato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you plan your steps, if you think about things properly, then you will see the redemption. And this has nothing to do with, thank you, the word was appraiser. I couldn't come up with the word in my head right then. But if you basically calculate your moves, you will see the redemption, right? As opposed to a person who doesn't think and plan. Shene'emar v'sam derech, al tikche v'sam ela v'sham, right? Very often it's just a dot, goes on one side or the other, so move it to the other side, and you should read it as v'sham derech er'ena b'yesh Elohim. Here we're going to see a story about someone who did this and fulfilled this verse, and they also, right, they read it in the same way as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yanai, havaleahu talmida, he had a student, dechol yom hava makshele, who every day would ask him questions. But when it came to, right, you all know those students who ask lots of questions, it kind of trip you up sometimes. So in a normal situation, it's okay. But when it was the Shabbos of the Regel, and there were tons of people who came to listen to the Shiur, he was smart enough to know this isn't the right time to ask my teacher questions. Because if he gets tripped up, it'll be a huge embarrassment. So Kare Ale, we're now moving to Amud Bet, V'sham derech er'ena b'yesh Elohim. Someone who calculates his moves will see the redemption. So here he did something that was worthy of that. Okay. That was the whole second part of today's daf, which was 9 different interpretations of where we see an allusion to a hint to this idea that one needs to mark the graves. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're going to bring another bright and that's going to take us through to the end of the daf and into tomorrow's, which is Ein mitzaynim lo. When we talk about making a grave marker, in what cases do we make a grave marker? Okay, there's all sorts of cases of dead bodies. You can have a full dead body, that for sure you need a grave marker, but there's all sorts of other situations. So now we're going to see which ones would require, which ones wouldn't. Ein mitzaynim lo al kazayit min hamet. Not if you only have a kazayit left of the dead body, okay, of the flesh. V'lo al etzem kiseora. When it comes to the bones, generally, we say the size of a bone that's the size of a barley will be metame, but is impure, but we don't mark that. We'll see in a minute why not. Velo al davar she'eno metame ba'oel. There's different types of the impurity carries different levels of impurity. There's things that are metame by touching them. That's called maga. There's things that cause you to be impure by carrying them. Let's say I carry it on a tray, but I'm not actually touching it. I'll still become impure. That's laws like etzem kiseora, for example, but they're not mitame ohel. What is ohel? So ohel means if we have some part of a dead body in a tent. So if it's an etzem, a bone the size of a barley, this is not going to have a law of ohel. Okay? Kazayit, we'll see, actually does, and we're going to have to resolve that one. We'll get to that soon. So let's say you have a kazayit of a body in your house, or you have a whole dead body in your house, everything in the house becomes tameh. What if I walk what if I'm outside? There's no cover. I walk outside and I walk right over a grave. So then if it has tumat ohel, if it doesn't have tumat ohel, it's like etzem, a bone, like a barley, then nothing happens if I don't touch it. But if I walk over it and it has the law of ohel, let's say it's a whole body, the tumah goes all the way up. And when I walk on it, I'm what's called ma'ahil alamet. I basically create my own. I'm tenting over the mate. And basically I become tameh. If, for example, we'll get to this soon, that's why I'm mentioning it now. If there's a tree over the dead body, and let's say the dead body's on the left side and the tree hangs out over to the right, anywhere under the tree is also going to be tameh. That's also from din ohel. Okay? So now, what they're saying is the only graves that you have to mark, which makes sense, are ones that if people pass over them without touching them, they'll become tameh. So it's only going to be on those kinds. Aval, so what are you mitzaynim? Mitzaynim ala shidra, if you have the whole spine, the vertebrae, ala gulgolet, the skull, al rov binyan va'al rov minyan, if you have most of the structure of the body or the majority of the bones in the body, even if it's not the majority of the structure of the body, right? You're thinking of like a skeleton or something, then those all are mitame ba'ohel, and therefore you'd have to mark them. Now another topic, but this is still within the Braita. It's another type of thing that you do or don't need to mark off. If everyone knows there's a cemetery here and there's dead bodies all over, you don't need to mark it, because the whole purpose of marking on Yantif, on Chol Moed, is so that people know. But if everybody knows, then there's no reason to have to mark it. You specifically mark off when there's a doubt. Now, this is a little tricky, because if you've learned laws of impurity, you know that safek tuma in the public space is actually, if you have a doubt about it, this is all learned out from the Sota. We're not going to get into the whole drasha right now, but you don't have, it's not, if you have a safek, a doubt about tuma in a public space, it's not tameh. However, there are certain cases where it is, and that's why they're going to explain to you, these are sfeikot that would be problematic, and you then need to mark them because people won't necessarily know there's graves there. Schachot upraot ubeit hapras. Okay, we're going to hold off on defining all these, and we're going to define them soon. Ve'ein mamidim tziyum b'makom tum'ah shelo lahafsid et hatarot. Now, when you put it down, the marker, you put it not exactly where the grave is. You have to put it a little before, because if you put it exactly where the grave is, I'll only bump into it and notice it when I get there. Let's say I'm a Kohen and I walk and I get there. By the time I've seen the marker, it's almost too late. I've already become tameh, and then I'm going to impurify, all sorts of things that are like truma. I'll touch the truma and I'll ruin it. So because of that, we basically move it a little bit farther away from the grave so that you realize before it's too late. But you don't move it too far away. There's a beautiful line, maybe in honor of Tu B'Shvat, right? So that you don't ruin the beautiful land of Israel. If you turn everything into potential grave areas, people won't be able to walk places and they'll have to kind of avoid the land of Israel. So we don't want to move it too far. So we do it a little bit. Okay, that's the end of the bright. Now the Gemara is going to start asking questions. This I told you before. What do you mean a kizayit min amet? Kizayit min amet is matame ba'ol. So how can you list it and say you don't have to mark it because it's not matame ba'ol? So hatnan, it says in a Mishnah, tnan and not Tanya, it's a mistake. Elu shemitamim ba'ol. These are the things that are matame in ohel. Kizayit min amet. One of the things listed there is kizayit min amet. So it is. So Rav Papa says this is what they're referring to. We're talking about when you had a piece of flesh from the body, it was exactly a kizayit, precisely, not anymore. Why? Very soon, what's going to happen? The flesh is going to disintegrate. It's going to become less than a kizayit very soon. Now, the assumption here is when it's buried there, everybody knows right away that it's buried there. So at that point, you don't need to make a marker because everyone's going to know it's there. The problem is in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, people won't know. So they say, in this case, in 2-3 weeks, it's not going to be a kizayit anymore. Better that people will know right now. So they'll know that if they came in contact with they walked there, and then they touched truma, they ruined it, then they'd have to burn it. But we don't want you to be burning truma down the road, because in the end, this isn't actually going to be tamei oel because it's less than a kazayit. So you don't mark it in that case. Now we're going to get back to the svekot, and this is going to take us through the end of today's daf. Elu hena svekot, schachot upraot. Schachot is ilana mesach ala aretz. This I talked about before. It's a tree. Now Rashi says we're talking about a tree that's near a cemetery, and it's kind of outside the cemetery, and is leaning over into the main drag. And the issue is that there's a good reason for concern that because it's a hidden place, and because it's near the cemetery, it could be someone actually buried someone there, in which case they're buried under the tree, in which case where the tree is jutting out into the public domain is a safek tuma case, that we have to be concerned that there might be tuma there. Okay, and even though safek tuma b'reshut harabim is usually okay, this is a high likelihood of it being. So then you would have to mark it. Praot are very similar. It's avanim pruot hayotzot min hagader. You have a fence, and there's stones coming out of it. Again, they're creating a sort of tent over it. And if there's a concern, because it's near a cemetery, that there's a dead body under there, then you have to worry about where it's jutting out as well. Beta pras. What is beta pras? Keditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, hachoresh et hakever. If you plow a field that has a grave in it. Okay, so someone's buried there, and then you plow the field. What happens? All the bones are going to get chopped up into pieces. But there's still a concern that maybe there's bones all around this field, because now you've spread them, right? At some point it was in one place. Now it's spread all around the field. You don't know where it is. So the whole field is what we call problematic. Mida Rabbanan, the rabbis forbade it. Okay, basically said, if you walk through this field, you become tamei. How far, and as if you're plowing, how far is this going to be? I see you're asking, did it come up in Eruvin? It definitely comes up in different places, possibly in Eruvin. It comes up a lot in the Gemara. Miloma ane mea ama. We assume a furrow, okay, when you plow in a furrow. So it's down that furrow for 100 amot from where the grave was originally. That whole area, you have to assume, is now tamei. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, ubeita pras mima tamei ba'oel. It doesn't have tumat oel. How do we know this? Because Hama reviewed it, and then it doesn't make sense in the Mishnah that we'd have to be mitzayin, because we just said you don't have to mark it if it's not tumat oel. Hama Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, menapech adam beita pras v'olech. So Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that when you're a Kohen and you want to walk through a Beit HaPras, what do? You start blowing. Because we assume there's some bones up, right? There's some bones around. If you blow them, they'll blow in front of you. You won't touch them. Now that seems to imply we're only worried about little bones and not big bones that will be tamei tumat oel. Because if we're worried about tumat oel, you couldn't walk in the field at all if you're a Kohen. So there it seems like there's no tumat oel. In addition, they quote this other line, which isn't so important for our purposes right now. Rabbi Yehuda bar Ami mishmei ulamar beta pras shenidash tahol. I guess it's also important because if tons of people walk through, you can assume that they've broken up the bones into such small pieces that they're not tamei anymore. So you see here that a beta pras, all the issues are less than what would be matame tumat oel. We're just assuming these are all small bones. So Amar Papa lo kashya. He says, there's two kinds. Kam b'sadesh avad b'kever, kam b'sadesh nechrash b'kever. When we said you have to mark it, that's a grave, that's a field that we know someone's buried, we just don't know where. So we have to forbid the whole field because we know it's somewhere. And then it's actually intact and it's tamei tumat oel. But when you have a sadesh nechrash b'kever that was plowed, then you don't have to worry about siyum kever. So now they ask, this sadeh, now here there's a problem with the girsa. Most people say it's sadesha avad kever, beta pras karela. If you lose a kever in a field, that's beta pras? I thought beta pras was sadesha nechrashba, that was plowed. No, that's also called the hatnan. It says in the Mishnah, shlosha batei prasim. There's three types. Sadesha avad kever, sadesha nechrashba kever. Both of these are beta pras. And stebochin. What is stebochin? My stebochin, right? The field of crying. What is that? People part from the dead in this field. They would bring the dead bodies before they buried them, and people would kind of say their last words to the people. Maybe they eulogize them here. It's not exactly clear, but that place is called the stebochin. Now, tamamai, why is it tamei? This is a very interesting line. Some people say it's because you might drop bones from the dead body in this area while they're kind of talking and, saying their parting words. And people maybe thought someone else will pick up the piece and nobody picked it up. And that's Yehush Baalim. Everyone kind of gave up on it. That's a weird interpretation to think about bones from a dead body falling as they were bringing it to the grave. But some people say what it means is people, they call this a Veda Pras because they wanted people only to use this for this purpose. They didn't want it to be taken over and somebody will plant there or do other things in that field. So they basically called it a Veda Pras so that people would stay away from it and know that we're going to keep this just, right? Yeush Balim is that people will kind of say, oh, we don't need this for anything else because we're using it just for this purpose. Okay. Now we're going to have one more question. Wait a minute. We just said if it's nechrashba, it's not tamei to at all. So therefore, why would it doesn't need a marker? But now they say, wait, doesn't it? The Hatanya, doesn't it say matzah sadeh mitzuyemet ve'eni yodea mativo? If you find a sadeh with a marker and you don't know what type of field it is, yesh ba'ilanot biyadua shenechrash ba'kever. Now you knew there was a kever, but now you see trees. So you know that they plowed it. So you know then there's no tumat oil anymore because they've broken it up. Yesh ba'ilanot biyadua sha'aba ba'kever. If it doesn't have trees, ain ba'ilanot, doesn't have trees, you know that there was just, you know, somewhere there's a kever, you just don't know where. But what do you see here? It's a sadeh mitzuyenet, even if it's nechrash ba'kever. That's going to be our problem. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ad sheyesh sham zakeno tamid, lefi she'ena kol b'kiim davar, you need a zakeno tamid to tell you that right there, the ones who really know these things. So the answer is, Amar Papa, Kitanya hi b'sadeh she'ava b'kever, ditzinua. Why did it have a marker? Not because it was nechrash b'kever. It was because it originally, there was someone buried there. That's how a Beit HaPras starts. That's why they put the marker up. And then, yesh ba'ilano, the question is what happened to it after? The marker was up before when it was a full body. Now, right, the whole question is, yesh ba'ilano, b'yadua shenechrash b'kever, ein ba'ilano, b'yadua she'ava b'kever. We'll stop here for today. But basically, we tried to bring this to say, isn't that, why is there a tziyun there if it's potentially nechrash b'kever? And the answer, because originally it had a full grave. There was some tamei oel, and that's why they put the marker up. Only after, the question is, the marker's still there, we just don't know what the status of it is, and that all depends whether there's trees or whether there aren't trees. In the end, we get back to trees on Tu B'Shvat, so there you have it. Have a great Tu B'Shvat, everybody, and we'll meet up tomorrow.